let's leave the borders of the United States of America. I want to talk briefly about what it is like applying to not even college, now universities, I
Hmm.
think they're called, outside the US. Tell me about the UK.
The UK implement kind of like Common App. They implement something called the UCAS system. It's kind of a unified system. Um, European schools in general, right, including Britain, they're not part of Europe at the moment, but including Britain, uh,
Geographically, let's say
yeah,
Europe.
geographically, they're very explicit about the requirements that you need to get into the school. And so, in a sense, uh, you're a lot more aware of where you where you can and can't
By
apply.
requirements, you mean classes or numbers?
Classes, numbers, everything, right? With IB scores, they tell you exactly what the minimum number you need, and they tell you very definitively they're not going to take you if you're under that number. So in a sense, I think as a student, it's a lot more comfortable, right? Applying to European schools in general. The one difficulty I think with European schools is that you need to study till your second semester of senior year, right? Because a lot of them are going to give you a conditional acceptance. So they'll give you a decision, let's say hypothetically in January and February, and demand that you get fives on your APs or you get sixes or sevens on certain IBs. And if you don't meet those requirements, they're going to rescind that acceptance and they're going to rescind that offer. Now, as for studying in European schools, they're more profession focused, right? They want you to graduate in 3 years, right? And go get a job, right? So a lot of the programs in Britain and in Europe, you can finish your major in 3 years. And they're probably going to try to get you connected to some company or some internship so that you can start building a career in a particular field.
So not a liberal arts approach.
Certainly not, right? The U.S. schools tend to be more about this kind of diverse education, exploration, where British schools with European schools in general, you better know what you want to do, right? You go into the school, you finish your degree, and then go get a job. And if you need to go to graduate school, then you can do that as well.
If you're here and you're thinking about, they're talking a lot about college, but not exactly how to craft a college app, that's next
It's
episode.
coming.
But
It needs to be its whole other thing.
yeah, there's so
It's
much that goes into
so much
creating
information.
a college application, a cohesive story for U.S. colleges. But for UK, it might be a little more streamlined. So we'll address it here. What is kind of the differentiator, the tiebreakers, if you're applying to European colleges?
I think European colleges, if
Like
you have the numbers, right? And
trying
if
to
you're
get them high as
very
possible.
right, and if you know exactly what you want to do, I think it's a very attractive choice, right? Because the essays that are required in the UK too, they don't require a lot of creativity. You
They're not quirky. Give me a top
Oh,
10 list.
no. Right. No, they tell you exactly what do you want to study here? What have you done to support this, right? And what do you want to be? What do you hope to gain from your university experience? I guess the only difference is that there might be a very difficult interview that comes after that application. Multiple interviews from the same school, in some certain situations, right? 2 to 3 interviews, which will play a very large role, right, in whether you get accepted or rejected by a college. Um,
The whole process is more about how competent you are as a candidate to study this thing.
right, and it's very junior. It's very much based on your performance in 11th and 12th grade, I think. Whereas American colleges do. Of course, they put a lot more weight in your junior year, right? Junior and senior year performance, but they will consider freshman grades and sophomore grades. They'll also look at things like extracurriculars. I find that European schools tend to disregard any extracurricular that has nothing to do with your major, right? Volunteer work, it really doesn't matter to them, right? They want to know whether you did some research, whether you wrote an EE,
If you're a politics
right?
major, did you do debate?
Yeah,
If
did
you're an
you do
engineering
right,
major, are you in the math club?
right, and it's a lot more straightforward, and I think it's a lot more predictable whether students are going to go in or not go into
And are
certain
the interviews very similar in terms of they're trying to get to know you as a academic?
I think, yeah, as an academic, right? They don't need to know you as a person, right?
Right.
They want to know what you did and what you hope to, hope to do after college, right? It's the kind of questions they ask.
That seems like a very attractive option now that I'm listening to this conversation, because we meet a lot of students who are applying to US colleges that sit down, because a lot, and we're going to talk about this later, but the US application, like writing the Common App, it's really about like putting forth like a character, like this is who I am as a person, like these are the experiences I have, these are the values I have, like this is who I am, and I want to expand my horizons at your campus. And a lot of students really struggle with that and struggle to say something interesting about themselves. It almost seems like applying to UK schools is like a very attractive choice for those students who struggle with it, of being like, I don't know how to say that I'm a really interesting person, but I can show you that I'm very competent and committed to this discipline.
So a lot of people who end up going to the British schools, they tend to be high performing students, right? Who just don't want to be bothered, right? Going through the loopholes of
Writing
the
3 to 4
American
apps.
application, right? I mean, you can write a UCAS essay in a week, right? It can be done in 2 to 3 drafts because you just make a very basic structure to your essay. They're not looking for very creative, attractive writing,
It
right?
feels more like a grad school app for the US.
Feels more like a graduate
Clear,
school app. Clear, concise.
concise.
Make it, have paragraphs. Make sure your grammar's right. Run your essay through Grammarly, right? And if you have the numbers, there's a very good chance, like you see offer rates of very good universities, like Imperial College London, being close to 40%. You're not going to get that in the States, right? Imperial is in the top 3 to 4 schools, right, in Britain.
Now, maybe a wrinkle if you're applying to Oxford or Cambridge.
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference for those two?
What's the difference between with those two? They're
Again,
going
those
to
relative
have.
to the rest of the colleges in the UK.
Well, there's going to be a lot
unis.
of lot of interviews.
Yeah.
Right, lot of interviews. I've heard up students have to do up to 3 to 4 interviews. Right.
Whew.
I did 4.
You did. If you got to 4, it means that you passed the first 3, right? Because some people get 1.
Well, the thing is, they sent me to other colleges within the uni. So
Mm-hmm.
I have a feeling that they were like, this guy seems okay, but not for us.
Mm-hmm.
How about you? So
They tossed you around a little bit.
yeah, and I bombed all of them.
Oh, but there's isn't there a rumor, at least in a place like Oxford, that they'll reject you right at the door if you don't think the door.
That happens too, yeah.
Yeah, so there is certainly that difficulty. And the other difficulty, I think, with we call it Oxbridge, right?
Yeah.
Is that they're going to demand very, very high final senior scores, right? If you're doing IB, expect a 41 out of 42. They're going to want 40 plus. With APs, they might ask for all 5s in 3 to 4 AP tests that you take in May. So there's a lot of stress with students who do get at least a conditional acceptance.
You gotta stay locked in until the very end.
Right. And with a lot of those students, you do not want to pull out your application for American schools just in case, right? I've actually seen people make that mistake whereby they get a conditional acceptance to a British school and then they end up pulling out they end up not applying to American schools. So I have to encourage them to apply to at least one because you never know what's going to happen, right? On an exam in May.
You mentioned that Hong Kong and Singapore is very similar.
Hong Kong and Singapore are very similar, very straightforward. They basically tell you the requirements of their programs, right? Wide range of. I think there's a lot of deviation between programs. Like for HKU, right? Hong Kong, the business program is very it's infamous for its very high requirements, right? Singapore, all of the 3 big Singaporean schools, that is what NUS, SMU, and NTU, all very high requirements to get into the schools. But again, with the European schools, with some of the Asian schools, right? They're very clear on what is required to get into their programs. So if you have the numbers, it's always something to consider, right? Because if you meet the minimum requirements, you might get up to 40 to 50% offer rate at that point.
Now tell me about the Great White North.
Canada. Oh, I come from a Canadian school myself.
Canada.
Okay.
Canada. Well, the saying goes with Canada is it's very easy to get into Canadian schools, but it is very difficult to graduate, right? Again, I think Canada's a bit of a hybrid, right? They're not going to be as explicit as, say, the European schools, right? The requirements are a little lower in Canada. So, for example, in Toronto, they'll tell you that the minimum GPA that you need to go to U of T is what, 3.4, 3.3, relatively low, right? That being said, it differs widely with majors, right? So if you're going into the business program in Toronto, it's called Rotman, right? You probably need a 3.8 or 3.9 to get into to even be considered an applicant. The sciences are always going to be much more difficult in Canada, just because there are so many international students in Canadian schools. I heard a number. It was kind of an interesting number at UBC, University of British Columbia. I believe it was like 40% to 50% of the school were international students. Just because Canada doesn't have that many, it doesn't have a very large population, right? So they're going to have to fill in the school one way or the other. So that being said, and generally, international students tend to be more focused, right? Tend to go more into the STEM subjects.
What about the specialty schools?
The specialty schools, I think the American schools are a lot better. You're not going to get a lot of art schools, right, in Canada. They tend to be smaller colleges that do offer that. But in terms of students who are very interested in art or theater, they tend to go study in the United States, right? Because number one, there are more opportunities there. There's a very small film industry to speak of in Canada, but most of the very famous performers end up coming to the US anyways.
Well, if you want to work in Canada, then it's
Right.
fine.
With the tech schools in Canada, the national universities will offer, right? Engineering, right? Most famously, of course, Waterloo, right? Which is known for their engineering program. I suppose one thing Canada does offer is a pre-med program or pre-law program, right? So in that sense, they're closer to the European schools.
And the essays are less. Well, there are less of them.
There are less of them. There will be certain. So I know UBC. They have three very small essays, but there's no personal statement per se,
It's
right?
not the big 1 to 2 pagers that they'll
One
ask
to two
you.
pagers, right? They're going to ask you for 200 words on a very important extracurricular activity that you had. But there will be essays for highly competitive programs. So if you're going into Toronto Rotman, right, which is the business program, you will have to do an online recording and an online interview, right? On top of writing maybe 3 to 4 responses that are timed, right? So you go into an internal Toronto program and they'll give you 20 minutes to write 400 words on why you want to study business. If you do go to, say, a medical school, a pre-med program in a highly competitive program, they'll ask you.
So do your research on what degree, what program you want.
So in that sense, they're closer to the European schools. Again, they're not going to ask you for certain values or anything like that. They want to see whether you're actually good at what you do.
And
Right?
Australia?
Australia is very similar to the British system.
Okay.
I'm currently working with a student who is applying to an Australian pre-med program. Their personal statement it almost mirrors the UCAS application. So what do you want to major? What have you done to kind of help you, right, with that major? What do you hope to accomplish, after university? So again, about 2,000 to 3,000 characters, which ends up being about 400 words, 300 to 400 word personal statement. So quite close. The Commonwealth countries tend to have a very similar application process.
Now, tell me about Korea and Japan.
Korea and Japan.
Just very briefly, for some of our listeners, it might apply. I doubt it, but
Yeah, actually, that's interesting because we kind of jumped a little bit when we were. Because it's interesting you bring that up because Korea and Japan. One of the things we will talk about, SAT is very important in applying to Korea Japan schools. But because we have talked about UK, Canada, Australia schools. If you're under the assumption that you're like a U.S. student or maybe you're an American student coming from an international school, other than like GPA, is standardized testing also going to be a big consideration for those countries, or is it not really outside?
Singapore, Hong Kong, yes.
Okay.
They will consider, all the Asian schools will consider SAT or ACT. The UCAS system, generally, you can send an SAT score, but it's simply there to, it's just supplementary material, if anything.
It's not a
not
huge
really gonna-
consideration.
It's not going to affect,
Okay.
right, you getting in or not. Now, Canada is very interesting because Canada, I suppose I can speak about Canada a little more in detail. But generally speaking, there tend to be schools that are more European in the way they approach applications, and then there are schools that tend to be more American. So if you go to schools like the University of British Columbia, so the more west you go in Canada and the more central you go, they tend to be more American. They do like SAT scores because UBC, you get a lot of applicants from Seattle and Oregon. It's so close, right? So a lot of students from those two states will actually submit an SAT score. I know for schools in the prairies, we're talking mainly about the University of Alberta and Calgary. They do highly recommend American students send an SAT or ACT score. The requirements are not as high. I've seen, I believe the last time I checked was like 1,200 is what you need, right, to get in. But of course, even in a school like University of Alberta, which is known for their science research, right, if you're going to go into a competitive major, you probably want to score a little higher, right, on a standardized test. As for the Ontario schools, so your Torontos, your Waterloos, they tend to be. I've seen many students get into those schools without an SAT or ACT score. But and again, I've seen people submit, just above average SAT scores, right? High 1300s, 1400s, and it's certainly not going to hurt you, right? In submitting those kinds of scores. And of course, in Canada, there are the French schools, right? So the schools in Quebec and Ottawa. The most famous one, I think, is McGill, right? McGill is the one school in the province of Quebec that teach fully in English, right? The two schools in Ottawa, they're bilingual, so you get to choose, right? And then the other schools in Quebec, all instruction is all done in French. So they have their own language aptitude tests for that to get into those schools.
So you got to kind of figure out what schools you want to go to and if you might need to do testing or not.
Yeah, but the Canadian schools do look at AP scores, especially for competitive programs. Pre-med, if you're not doing an IB program, they do probably want to see some form of AP scores on bio, chem, or physics, math, right? It certainly will help you get into those competitive programs.
Now, Korea, Japan. What's it like there? What do you want to score? What's the app looking like? And difference between, I guess, a foreigner and a resident?
The rules with Korea, so there's like 4 to 5 schools in Korea, right? Very big schools, all located kind of in the Seoul area. Very different as a foreign applicant and as a domestic applicant. But the interesting thing here is to be considered a foreign applicant in Korea, you need to have lived in a foreign country for 7 or 8 years and have your parents be foreign citizens as well. So kind of the bar is very high here. But you see differences in acceptance rates of about 30 to 40%, right? So schools that generally have, say, an acceptance rate of 7 to 8% for domestic students will have an acceptance rate of 40% for foreign students. They will require an SAT score. The general rule is 1,500 and above. Because Korean students are required to take a college entry exam, they feel that foreign students also should submit or want a standardized exam as well. With the Japanese schools, what I do know is that there are certain schools in Japan that tend to be more foreign friendly, right? So we're talking about Keio,
Waseda.
Waseda. These schools, Sophia University, they tend to take a lot of foreign applicants. There are schools that on the upper end of Japan, University of Tokyo being one, they do not take a lot of foreign students. Extremely difficult to get into. If you do want to go to the University of Tokyo, best that you learn Japanese, right? Then
Not
you
a lot of English classes at those
no,
universities. Yeah.
right.
You can't do your degree in English.
Yeah, everything's done in Japanese. They also have their own standardized exam, which is notorious, right? We're talking about China, we're talking about Korea and Japan, all three countries with very difficult standardized exams, right? Test entry exams.
Yeah. So you got to have a very high SAT or ACT score to be considered kind of comparable to domestic applicants. There are like Calvin said, there are some schools like Waseda and Keio that are probably going to be more friendly to foreign applicants, or there seems to be like a better reason for you being there. For example, Waseda has a great like politics, like international
Studies, yeah.
studies, kind of foreign policy. They have a great program there, so it kind of makes sense for them to want or for foreign applicants to apply in general. But you're still going to need like a really high standardized testing score. You're going to definitely need a great GPA. What I have seen in the past is you have to also have a good reason of wanting to be in Japan.
Right. I do agree.
Very
with that.
specifically, like not I want to go abroad and study, like I want to leave the US and like experience being international. You have to be a very specific reason for why you want to do that in Japan, and why this university is the good place for you to do that.
So I had a student who applied to KO. This is about, I think, 7 or 8 years ago. She specifically said in her essay that she wanted to join a Japanese company, and that's why she was applying to KO, and it got her in, right? But if you're just kind of going there to visit, right? Probably not the best
convincing.
way. Not the best way to convince those schools.